Today I'm going to be talking about selection and genetic variation. We'll specifically be looking at genetic drift, gene flow, oscillating selection, and fitness. So today we're going to start off with genetic drift. Genetic drift is a change in alleles due to the change of population where a certain allele will become dominant. So this is basically talking about how there's a change in the population due to an event or something catastrophic happening, and a certain allele will become dominant that previously wasn't. So looking at examples, there are examples such as the bottleneck effect, which occurs when there's a change in the environment and only a few alleles survive from a population. So there will be less genetic variation as there'll be fewer variants of an allele, and certain genes may become predominant in a population that weren't previously. So an example would be if there's 10 different colors of mice, and although these mice live in a dark environment, the brown will be predominant, but for some reason there was a flooding and all the brown mice died and there were a few white mice. These white mice would then become the predominant allele and spread their allele to the next generation. This reduced genetic diversity as now there's fewer different shades of brown mice, and they're also less well adapted because they're a worse color, which you're able to see them if you're a predator. And then we also have the founder effect. The founder effect is when a small population is separated, reducing the genetic diversity. So for example, if a small population was slightly separated and then there was a flood or a volcano eruption or something, and something stopped them from joining the general population again, they'd be isolated, and any genetics that they would be passed off to the offspring. There's a low genetic diversity because there's a lower number of species in the population. So this would create a founder effect and could eventually lead to a new species, because they'll eventually be so genetically different to the original population that they wouldn't be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Genetic flow. Genetic flow is the movement of alleles from one population to the next. So there's normally from two. This flow occurs within a population. It will increase genetic diversity. But most commonly, this occurs between two different populations, where it will reduce the genetic diversity as we make the two populations more similar. So gene flow is basically gene coming from a different population and decreasing the genetic diversity. For example, if you have let's look at the Galapagos Islands. Theoretically, if there was a finch that was really well adapted to eating hard seeds, so it had stronger beak, which was slightly more pointed, so it could pick them off the ground, and the mainland bird, it was adapted to eating softer seeds, so it didn't have as hard a beak and it was a bit more long and thin, and they bred, it would make a worse. It would decrease genetic diversity, as now you have all these animals with the same kind of weaker beak, and it would also reduce how effective they are. So now we look at ring species. This is where genes can be similar even if animals can't breed back and forth. So they can pass on genes even though they can't breed with each other. It's kind of a long way around the basic passing on genetics. So just really quick summary. In a circle, A can't mate with C, but they can both mate with B. So genetics from A can be passed to B, which can then be passed to C, as they both have similar genetics. So example, also we can here see with these colors, red can't mate with purple, but red can mate with orange, can mate with yellow, mate with green, mate with blue, which can mate with purple, which will pass the genetics route in a ring. That's why it's called the ring species. Next, we'll finally be looking at oscillating selection. This is basically where selection favors certain conditions throughout the year depending on the situation. So for example, if it was winter and mice, then the selection would favor the white mice, and if it was summer, for the same allele, it would favor the brown mice because they'd be more camouflaged. Fitness is a measure of level of reproductivity. how many offsprings an individual is able to produce. So this doesn't necessarily mean how healthy the offspring are, but more of how many they can produce. How is that selected if they increase fitness? So obviously, the more offspring you can produce, the higher chance your genes are passed on through generation to generation. So if you have an allele that allows you to increase fitness, this will be very helpful and be able to be passed on. So there's 3 different types of selection that we're going to talk about today: directional, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So here we go. If we look at the table, the graph, directional selection favors one trait over another. So for example, if we go back to mice, if it's in a forest, the selection will favor the darker color mice. Stabilizing disruptive selections, this is this third image here, it will favor the 2 extremes. So for example, if you live in a climate which has also got woodland and snow, it will favor the dark mice and the light white mice, but anything in between wouldn't have either kind of phenotype to allow it to distinguish itself and survive. And finally, stabilizing, which favors one specific trait heavily. So for example, if we go to woodland again, and your brown mice, if it's black, it's not going to survive because it'll be too easy to spot, and if it's white, it'll be too easy to spot for predators as well. So it really heavily favors that one allele or phenotype. So our final thoughts today: adaptation will always continue as long as there's an environmental change, and normally there's always an environmental change. So adaptation evolution is constant. Genetic drift and gene flow don't always lead to adaptation. They can have a negative effects on a population, as we've already discussed. Thank you very much for listening.